Another way to look at games is a visions model of internalized depression and modernism behaviors. And I'm going to ask Val if you want to say a little something about it.
As I was thinking about the ways in which we are socialized culturally and the ways and the reality of the isms, I started thinking about this model, and out of that developed the 5 modernism behaviors and the corresponding internalized oppression behaviors. Not alone, but along with 2 other black psychologists back in Richmond back in the day. And what we were looking at this dance. I mean, this one way to think about this is that it becomes a dance. So modernisms is what are behaviors that I do from my non-target places, from places where I have historic power. So if I am a counselor and I have a client and I see that client and they are being in the victim position, I can dysfunctionally rescue them rather than ask them, what is it that you want to do? So when and if the client doesn't feel empowered or doesn't know what they want, they might come into the session doing what we call system beating, trying to get me to do for them. So another example of that is someone who's sad or depressed and who's thinking that if they can get medication, it will feel better. So they come into the emergency room. When I was first using this model, a person would come into the emergency room and they would figure out which doctors were willing to give them medicine without being willing to talk with them about what do you want and need and what is the problem and all of that. So we developed we don't call them games, but we call them behaviors. In fact, Angela has been calling them lately behavioral traps. The idea that from my one-up place, I do modernism, I do dysfunctional rescuing, and I can only do dysfunctional rescuing if the person on the other side is willing to be rescued. So that's where we say, I talked about my relationship with my university professor. So he was giving me a lot of critical feedback. He was doing that to help me. And I wasn't clear about that. The intent didn't match because of my cultural script. I saw it as he was being critical. Like Lena said, I saw it as he was telling me I couldn't think, I wasn't a good person, right? So I was taking it as a blame in the victim, actually, in this case. I wasn't taking it as dysfunctional rescuing. And I initially was feeling less and less okay about myself. So I was going into an internalized oppression behavior of wanting to avoid the meetings or of putting myself down and not asking for feedback or information about what was happening. So that was my side of the game. But because I had learned this model, I realized that well, how can I assume? I shouldn't assume that that it's about my essence, that it's my right to ask that. So when I went in and asked it and he said what he said, I was off the triangle. I didn't need to play the game anymore. I didn't need him to change because I knew that he'd been doing this for 40 years. I did not have energy for that. And I wanted to get out of school. So I was interested in how do I get off this triangle and get out of here? And so that's a way that I took, we can break the cycle from either side. So we have, I'm not going to go into, that's not part of the official TA 101, but we do workshops about this across the country where we invite people to learn about this dance between modernisms and internalized oppression. The other thing I'll say about it is it's another way of talking also about the point I was making earlier, which is that after 1964 in this century, we asked the question, when did racism die? The Civil Rights Act was passed, but when did racism die? Would everybody agree that it hasn't, right? A lot of times when I do this in an all-white group, people will say, well, it's basically a fate of, there's a few bad apples. People will say there's a few bad apples. We call that a kind of modernism that's named denial of the significance of difference. So that if I then if I come from my historically excluded places and I buy that idea, oh, that racism isn't so bad, then we could play Ain't It Awful together, or we could pass time about that, and I could collude with my own oppression. So that's another way that the game can be played. The contrast to that is getting information about the continued way in which the legacy of oppression is playing out, not just historically, but now.
go along the lines of emotional incest.
Say more about how you.
So
it
this
sounds like it could.
Yeah. So I guess I'm gonna have to put myself in my own experience. Sorry, Mom, if this has been video recorded and you run across it. But whenever my mother was going through a hard time with my father, I was her firstborn son, and she emotionally attached herself to me.
Yeah.
My father is not able to emotionally help her out, so through a lot of my life, I was the one who pleased her, and she found a lot of confidence in the fact she done a good job raising me.
Yeah.
So now, as I've been doing my own personal work and getting out the drama triangle, she feels abandoned by me.
Yeah.
So in the
stop
drama
playing
triangle, when I find myself leaving and being assertive, I see the game between her and Dad is that you're the one that's running him away because you're an alcoholic. And no, you're the one that's running away because you're bitching and complaining.
Yeah.
And it's just like, no, I'm leaving because this is dysfunctional.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with me being assertive, I'm seeing that she's trying to get me back into the game.
Yeah, sister,
And
yeah.
I did play the game for a long time before
Yeah.
I did my own personal work and found myself rescuing him and prosecuting her
Yeah.
and realized later this is their bullshit, not
Yeah,
mine,
yeah,
and just
there you
now
go,
walk
yeah,
away.
yeah. That's called
And-
growing up.
Yeah, or redecision
Yes,
and
that's right.
reparenting.
Yes,
So
and
I'm
letting
looking
go,
at
yeah.
the symbiotic relationship along the lines of emotional incest, and that happens a lot in minority relationships with a female and a son.
Yeah.
That's what I'm realizing.
That's right. And that perfect example. And actually, that symbiosis is down in the, I don't want to go into that because that's advanced TA theory, but it's the child ego state of the mother, and you're taking care of her child ego state. Yeah, and it's done by it's second degree diagram. Okay.
I have a quick question. Could you clarify the word games? Because it
Who's
seems
saying
like
that?
a game is an intentional thing, a conscious thing, and it's suggested that it's not.
It's out of awareness.
So
Yeah.
how
The reason that game, that Byrne called it, he tried to give everything language that people would understand. And the connotation of game was that it gets done over and over. But the confusion is that games are fun. And I mean, some games are fun in that they wreak a lot of strokes, but they end up negative. But, so psychological game rather than just game.
Could I, for those of you who have been, who have taken psychology, we talk about defense mechanisms. So it's another way of talking about defense
Okay.
mechanisms also.
Got it.
So we've looked at several ways of looking at games, and the next characteristics of a game, as we've already mentioned several times, is that they're repetitive, they're out of awareness, they have a negative payoff, an ostensible adult stimulus. It sounds like it's an adult process that's happening, but there's a switch and it's the switch that differentiates games from rackets and pastimes. Why people play games, we've already mentioned this a lot, is to structure time.
Can we say that a racket is a racket until there is a switch, and then it becomes a game, or there are two different
A racket is
concepts?
mostly an internal process.
Okay,
And a game is with other people,
thank you.
yeah. But the racket and games are related in that usually the payoff feeling reinforces the racket internal process. Yeah.
But that is one of the differentiating characteristics. Rackets don't have a switch, games do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People play games to structure time. We were talking about the importance of structuring time. To reinforce the existential position, I'm not okay, or you're not okay in terms of kick me or persecutor games. To give and get strokes. And this reminds me that games can be real short. They happen in 10 transactions, or they can be very long. And then there's very long games, like a marriage that's been together for 30 years, and they've been playing this game over and over, but it's within the big, long game that the final payoff is a divorce, or worse. I don't want to talk about what could be worse, but, so the game can be short or long. But in the process, there's a lot of strokes that get exchanged. You know people who have fights, and then the making up is so much fun? So they make up, they get a lot of strokes, but then the fight happens again. So there's a repetition. And then the next one is to make people predictable and avoid intimacy. Because intimacy, as Van mentioned earlier, is high risk. because there's capacity to be hurt. And so games are a way to avoid intimacy and get a lot of strokes and create drama in our lives.
They satisfy all of the basic psychological needs. There are substitute ways of getting those psychological needs met. They provide lots of intense stroking. They structure time in a very dramatic and intense way. And they justify the basic existential life position.
How to avoid games is avoid the con. So I don't know what to do about my drinking husband, or I don't know what to do about my debt or whatever. That's the con. So you can either say, well, have you tried? You got the hook. But you can say instead, would you like something for me about that? It's a very, or mirror it and say, I hear that you're really concerned about your drinking husband. That's how to avoid the con. Confront the con and say, it sounds like you're needing something. Well, I wonder what it is. Ask for strokes directly. That's for the person initiating the game. Instead of saying, I don't know what to do about my husband, say, I don't know what to do about my husband and I need some help, and would you listen and help me and try to problem solve? That's to ask for strokes directly. Avoid discounting yourself or the other. It's kind of like that same thing. Learn from the payoff. Once you get to the negative feeling, and I've heard several examples coming up to me during breaks to say, I just learned from the payoff how I can do what I can do instead. And so that's a good place at the payoff is the only place that you can learn from the game. Yeah. And then practice responsivity. Responsivity is the next 2 pages, and Van has been talking a little bit, and we've been talking a little bit about healthy problem solving. And I've published this article 3 times in the TA Journal. The first time I published it was called Reactivity, and I did that one in '82. And I called it reactivity as the opposite of passivity. And that was react to your feelings and do something about it to get your problem solved. The second time I published it was called responsivity, because reactivity sounded negative. So and so I updated it and called it responsivity in '92. And then I wrote a third article about it to apply to the organizational and business settings that's called using the role of feelings in the workplace. All 3 of those is the same article about this process. And so just very briefly, the first page is, Van did a little bit about this, and did a little bit of review about this, which is what's the feeling, what's my need. If it's sad, I need to get support for my crying or get some space for crying. If it's mad, I need to set a boundary. If it's scared, I need some protection of some kind. But be aware that it may be a substitute feeling. It may be a racket that the feeling is. So does it, for instance, very often men I've seen very often who are angry and spending a lot of time being angry because they're sad about something. And so if you go try to solve the problem by setting boundaries, it won't work because it's not about an intrusion, it's about a loss. And so what you need to do is grieve instead. Somehow or another it gets to that. So that's the internal responsive process. You get it? Okay? And then so what you do then is go to the external responsive process to do something about it. And this is a combination of Claude Steiner cooperative process and also some of the material that I got from Jackie Schiff and just some stuff that I put in there together. But I figured that there were about 7 things that we do in order to solve a problem. Ask for what we want, and there are examples there about that. And yesterday I gave examples about asking for somebody to listen, asking somebody to brainstorm with you about solving a problem. There are all kinds of things that asking for strokes, asking for directions. There's lots of ways that we can solve a problem by verbalizing feelings, just sharing what's going on. We had a perfect example of that today when she said, I'm uncomfortable with the process that's happening. Where are you? Right. That was an example of verbalizing feelings about what was going on. I thought that was very healthy. And spoke for many of us, I think. Setting limits, you're not to do that to me. Whatever you need to set boundaries about. In terms of intrusion. And then checking out interpretations of fantasies about what you're thinking about other people. You've been ignoring me or avoiding me. I'm having this fantasy that you're angry at me or there's something going on between us. The important thing about the response to that is always to think about what might be the seed of truth in order to reinforce and stroke the intuition of the person, because they're picking up on something. They're not, the example that I gave about, mother, are you mad? No, I'm not mad. That's discounting the child's intuition. So you want to stroke the intuition and say, no, I'm not angry at you, but let me think about what might be happening that you're picking up on. So look for the seed of truth when somebody's doing that, checking out interpretation of behavior with you. And the other one is just sharing information about, I got an A in my class today, whatever information. Oh, I won't be on time tomorrow, so I wanted you to know that. Stroking, and we've talked a lot about that, and this is about positive stroking. Sharing stroke, I really like how you're doing that. Thank you all for the strokes you've given me about my presentations here. I've experienced that a lot. Thank you. And I wanted to also talk about accounting because that's very important. So there are 3 parts to accounting. One is I made an error. I can tell that impacted you. 2, what was going on with me at the time was such and such. I was distracted. I was not feeling well or whatever. And 3 is what I plan to do in the future is to correct that behavior. So that's part of accounting. So that's the internal and external responsive process that I like to focus on rather than focusing on games. I think if we do that, we'll avoid games. Identify the behavior that was that impacted negatively the other person. Identify what was going on with you that might have caused the behavior. I was not feeling well, or I was too busy, or I overbooked myself. I remember a lady that I used to schedule on Friday afternoons as a client. This was a long time ago. And I never stand up clients, but that one I did twice. And the second time I thought, what's going on here? And so what I realized was that I didn't like clients on Friday afternoons. So what was going on with me was that I was discounting that I didn't like clients, and that's how I accounted to her. And so we changed our appointment to other days other than Friday afternoon. And then what I plan to do in the next time is to meet you sometime other than Friday. Yeah.
Felipe, I work a lot with couples, and I have one couple where the guy spends 90% of the time trying to do this response on step number 2. I wouldn't recommend that. The one about all the things that were going on with him that got him from being responsive.
Just an excuse.
Yes.
Yeah.
So whatever apology is in there or whatever response gets lost.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, that can be overdone. And it's like if it weren't for, it becomes if it hadn't been for all of this stuff, but I'm not responsible. It's to get off. No, that doesn't work. It talks about what caused the error. Thank you, Brenda. I'm done.